So, final word on star clusters. We talked about open clusters and globular clusters. Open clusters tend to be pulled apart, and when they do, you still sometimes have just clumps of stars that are in the same vicinity in the galaxy. And we could call that a stellar association. So these stars are close enough that gravity interacts, but they are not bound together. They're not really star clusters. So that they could be what's left over from a star cluster that's evaporated, or it could be just a handful of similar stars that formed about the same time, but not really enough to call it a star cluster. The closest of the stellar associations actually turns out to be the stars of the Big Dipper. So we call this the Ursa Major Association. And so these stars and a few others turn out to be all about the same age. They're all moving in about the same direction, and they all have the same metallicity and age as the sun. So it's possible that the sun used to be part of a star cluster, that these stars used to be the part of the star cluster of as well. And since then, the sun and other stars have moved away, and then these are kind of what's left over of that star cluster. That's a possibility. Doesn't have to be what happened. OB associations, these are O and B type stars. They remember, these are the higher mass stars, the hotter stars that form first. So sometimes when a big cloud of gas is forming into stars, these four stars will form, O and B stars will form first, and they'll actually push away the gas and stop the other stars from forming sometimes. And so what you get are a clump of O and B type stars. They're not really gravitationally bound together to make a star cluster, but they are associated with one another. So OB associations, they're also very useful and very important in terms of studying the structure of the galaxy, because they're very short-lived sort of things. There's a couple factoids about star clusters. Open clusters and globular clusters form differently. They form a little bit differently. Globular clusters form very early in the history of the galaxy, and generally in a halo around the rest of the galaxy. And open clusters form typically later in the galaxy itself, in the disk of the galaxy. The Andromeda Galaxy has an interesting thing going on with it. It has some intermediate form clusters that are sort of in between globular clusters and open clusters. And the Milky Way doesn't have any galaxy clusters of that sort, and we're still trying to figure out what that means. One other interesting thing is, in our own galaxy, there seems to be two generations of globular clusters. Now, our galaxy is called the Milky Way. So there's two generations of globular clusters in the Milky Way. Most of the globular clusters formed about the time the galaxy formed, but there's a second group of them that formed between 500 million or 1 billion years later. So they're a little bit younger than the rest. And what does that mean? That could mean a variety of things. It could mean our galaxy interacted with another galaxy. It could also mean that our galaxy absorbed a younger galaxy, and the globular clusters that were part of that galaxy merged with ours. So again, these are some things that we'll talk about later on, but these are hints as to the history of the galaxy. Because one of the things we want to talk about in astronomy is not just what's out there, but how did it get that way? Main sequence fitting is another interesting thing, and we'll have a lab exercise that will work with this. If you were to plot the HR diagram using absolute magnitudes, then you plot absolute magnitude to the y-axis and color index B minus V on the x-axis, and you get the main sequence. Now, on the other hand, if you were to do the same thing for a star cluster, okay, but you don't know how far away the star cluster is. If you do not know the distance of the star cluster, then you would plot the absolute magnitude, big M, to get the main sequence, but you'd have to plot little m. Well, little m is typically going to be dimmer, and you're going to end up with a line that is shifted down from where the main sequence should be. Well, the shift is the difference between little m and big M. So that shift would be m minus m. Now, why is that important? Well, because we know that the distance can be 10 to the little m minus big M plus 5 divided by 5 exponent. Okay, so that shift right here is the m minus m. And so that goes in up here, and now we have a measure of the distance. Now this is useful for when you look at a star cluster. You don't know how far away the star cluster is, but you do see the stars in the star cluster, and you can plot them, and you see that on a color magnitude diagram, which is what you would call an HR diagram if you're plotting apparent magnitude instead of absolute magnitude. Then you would see that the line is separate from the line of another star cluster. The separation between the two you can use to find the distance. So this is a major way of finding distances to star clusters. So what we do is we use parallax to find the distance to nearby stars. Then we use main sequence fitting to find distances to star clusters. In those star clusters, then we see Cepheid variables, so that allows us to find the actual Cepheid variable period luminosity relationship mathematically, which you can then use to figure out distances to nearby galaxies. And so this is like what we call this bootstrapping, working your way up, or like a distance ladder. So you take first one rung, and then another rung, and then another rung, until you figure out how far away things are. All right, so why are star clusters important to us? All the stars in the star cluster form about the same time out of the same cloud of gas. So you get all different kinds of stars that are forming. So by looking at how star clusters age over time, or how they change over time, that allows you to figure out how stars age, how they evolve and change. So this allows us to study stellar formation, stellar evolution, stellar aging. You can also study the interstar medium, and because these are all about the same distance from us, you can use this to understand how distances are measured and calibrate distance scales, that bootstrapping I was talking about. And so these are all very important parts of star clusters and why they are important to astronomers.